and welcome to a five-part video series that we'll be having together with Dr. Avery Neal, covering her book, If He's So Great, Why Do I Feel So Bad? So I'm going to give a little intro to Dr. Avery Neal, and we're going to begin to have a discussion on Chapter 1. So Avery Neal is a practicing psychotherapist, researcher, international author. In 2012, she opened Women's Therapy Clinic, which offers therapy and counseling support to women. As I said, Avery is the author of If He's So Great, Why Do I Feel So Bad? Recognizing and Overcoming Subtle Abuse, which has been translated and published into 12 languages. She has spoken in numerous conferences alongside some of the world's experts in psychology. Her articles and interviews have been published in Oprah, Counseling Today, American Counseling Association, Daily Om, Conscious Life, and many others, including Best Self Magazine and Pop Sugar. And her courses and curriculum, which we will talk about a little bit today, have been taken by individuals, professionals, universities, and organizations worldwide. So, Avery, let's jump in and talk about your book and Chapter 1. My first question for you is, really why you wrote the book. If He's So Great, Why Do I Feel So Bad? So after years of treating women and controlling relationships, what were you seeing that wasn't adequately, addressing things? And so that really made you decide to write the book and expand on the clinical literature. And what do you want women to understand differently reading your book?
Absolutely. So this is a really important question. So I had a clinical practice for a number of years before I started to recognize some of the patterns that I was seeing. I worked extensively with women in general, a range of different issues and life circumstances and things that would bring them in. But when women were experiencing relationship problems, whether it was relationship issues in their primary relationship, which was predominant, or other relationships, as we begin to scratch the surface, in a lot of these cases, I started to notice some of these patterns emerging. And, I looked around. I love to read, I love to learn, and I just could not find something that really defined or addressed what I was recognizing and noticing. And I really wanted to break it down to the simplest patterns, and not get too complex, but make it really understandable so that people could see, okay, let me pay attention to this and this and this. And so, it really didn't start out as a book. It really started out as just, I wanted to write down what I was noticing over time with certain populations. And before I knew it, there was so much to say and so much that I had observed. It became a book very quickly. And so that was this first book, which is If He's So Great, Why Do I Feel So Bad? And I will say that a big reason why I gave it that title was because I wanted to, catch the audience that maybe is in an unhealthy, toxic, potentially abusive relationship, but maybe doesn't even recognize it as such, or doesn't know that what they're experiencing is in fact abuse and is incredibly damaging. And so maybe they don't even know to sort of reach for more resources that would be in the genre of abuse, because it wasn't meeting the classic symptoms. And so that was another hope, is to kind of bridge the gap, for women or for people who were experiencing these patterns that were incredibly unhealthy and damaging, but yet weren't necessarily recognizing it as abuse, and sort of how to kind of get their minds around it and identify these patterns that are so tangled and complex for anyone who's going through it. It's confusing at best. And of course, you're worn down. And so it's hard to see things clearly. And so my hope was to sort of make what was so intangible more tangible, and sort of act as a guide to illuminate some of the common patterns experienced.
I love that you wanted to make it understandable, and there was a gap and you recognized a gap, but the gap actually is a big gap, not like a small gap. And so you introduced the term subtle abuse. because the definitions didn't fully capture what you were seeing as you started to discuss. So, can you define subtle abuse for everyone and maybe give some examples? Because women might just dismiss something as like about maybe it's about them, and it's a normal relationship conflict. And why is having this language so important, Avery?
Absolutely. So I'm going to read the definition so that I can capture it fully. I am defining subtle abuse as the indirect use of threat, force, intimidation, or aggression through humor, manipulation, criticism, or punishment in attempt to control or dominate another, occurring on its own or in between verbally, physically, or sexually abusive episodes. So subtle abuse is something that is seen in all abusive relationships, and it's really the mechanism under which the person develops more dominance and control over another. And so, abusive relationships or unhealthy relationships, they don't start out that way. They start out like a normal, loving, healthy relationship in almost all cases. But what happens is that over time, these hurtful and damaging behaviors, really start to become more frequent and more severe. And so that's when we see kind of the escalation of abuse over time and the escalation of mistreatment over time. And so with subtle abuse, what I really was trying to point out are, some of the patterns that you can recognize and start to see showing up in these relationships that are really in between the more overt sort of flare-ups that are abusive. So obviously, an overt example would be physical abuse, for instance. So hitting, strangling, some sort of event that is very tangible, it's overt. And so those are easier to see. What's really important to pay attention to is all the stuff in between, all of the patterns that exist in between. And these patterns can occur on their own, even if someone isn't overtly abusive, isn't physically abusive or sexually abusive or financially abusive. It's important to see that these patterns are incredibly damaging and harmful. And the reason is that they strip away a person's confidence and self-esteem. To where they become sort of a shell of themselves, of their former selves. And it's a heartbreaking thing to watch. So when we talk about subtle abuse, it's not abuse that isn't that damaging or isn't that bad. We actually know that it is incredibly damaging because it's confusing. The person doesn't understand what's happening. They just start to lose confidence in themselves, and they become worn down over time. And these messages and these patterns stay with the person even after the relationship has ended. It's incredibly difficult to recover from this type of abuse because it's believable. You can almost think of it as sort of grooming or brainwashing. It's that kind of idea. It's how the person gains power and control, and sometimes without the victim even realizing it.
Wow, that's a lot you gave us there. Can you just talk a little bit about what you just mentioned about difficult to recover? And so maybe I think that's an important topic for those who are listening that maybe it starts to resonate. Like, what is that? What does that look like, or what could that look like?
Absolutely. So I'm glad you asked this question because this is a huge part of the work and recovery. These relationships are so confusing and so harmful that the recovery is lengthy. So when you're looking at someone who has sort of been systematically degraded over time, what happens is it really erodes their sense of self and their confidence and even their ability to trust their own reality. And so when we're looking at recovering from a relationship like that, a lot of times, people don't even know what they like anymore. Maybe they're afraid to speak up about their preference, about their thoughts or their ideas. They're sort of bracing themselves for some sort of punishment or criticism. So there's a lot of work to do around just kind of creating space for the person to come out of their shell and become themselves again. And then there's the additional layer of rebuilding confidence. And, when you've been criticized or, made fun of, and see, when we're talking about subtle abuse, this is often so cleverly disguised in humor and the isolation tactics even are so carefully crafted. It's not like it's overt where the abusive person is saying, I don't want you, seeing that friend or getting together with your family. No, this is really subtle, and it's over time, to where a lot of times victims of subtle abuse, they may even think that it was their idea, or this was their decision, because it's so carefully crafted over time. And so there's a huge amount of grief work even that comes from recognizing what someone's been enduring, what's happened to them. Even looking back and sort of putting the pieces together takes some time, because it's sort of shocking when you get sort of some distance from the relationship and you get a whole new perspective about, oh my gosh, this is actually, objectively speaking, this is what was happening over time. And I didn't even recognize it or realize it, perhaps. And so, that there's some grief associated with that, and what you've been going through, what you've been enduring, and sort of who you've become and how worn down you've become in that process.
That's really very helpful in even defining this more deeply, because as you say, it is subtle. And so being able to recognize those patterns or recognize the feelings. And I think this leads to our next question. You explained that the clearest evidence of abuse is often found in the recurring patterns, not just in the most obvious incidents, as you just said. What patterns should women pay attention to if she feels confused, diminished, emotionally exhausted, but can't explain why? And you started that, Avery. Maybe expand on that a little bit more.
Absolutely. So, some of the main common patterns, to be watching for are, a lack of empathy. So, is your partner empathetic? Do you feel like you are understood and that your needs are met? That's a really important, pattern to be paying attention to. And that, all of these patterns, by the way, go both ways. In a healthy relationship, both sides have empathy and understanding. And then, a sense of responsibility. So, is my partner equally responsible in the relationship? Because a lot of times in these dynamics, you get a partner that is overly responsible, and in the case of victims of abuse, they often take on more than their fair share of the responsibility in hopes of making the relationship okay, or making the relationship work, or keeping the peace. And so then that is sort of on one end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum is the abusive partner who doesn't take responsibility for their behavior and is blaming you or others for their behavior or for their misfortunes in life. And there's a lack of accountability, a lack of responsibility that can be seen within the relationship, and oftentimes outside of the relationship, whether that's in the workplace or with other relationships. So there's often also a jealousy component, and certainly that can be jealousy around, friends, or coworkers of the opposite sex, that type of thing. But we actually see that coming up quite frequently when we're talking about some of the more psychological abuse and subtle abuse type dynamics. We see the jealousy showing up even with friends and family members, even accomplishments or, promotions, anything that sort of strengthens you and strengthens your confidence and independence and autonomy can be perceived, and often is perceived by someone that's abusive, as a threat. And so you can see sort of jealousy flaring up, and again, that's often cloaked in making fun of a support system, or putting down the accomplishment that you've just had, minimizing it in some way or dismissing it in some way. So that's how jealousy can kind of present in these relationships. And then, of course, there's the whole isolation piece where the person becomes more and more withdrawn from their support system. So, friends, family, sometimes coworkers, or even work, as the abusive relationship just really does not support those other relationships, and the abusive person makes it quite difficult to maintain a close and healthy level of contact with others. And then, of course, often we see sort of a pattern of entitlement too. So, an abusive person often believes sort of the rules don't apply to them, or that they are justified in behaving the way that they are. So this goes sort of hand in hand, which a lot of these uh, patterns overlap. But the abusive person will blame their partner for the behavior or for the dynamic, or for whatever's going wrong, and they almost have a sense of entitlement that you're the problem, I'm great, I'm perfect, and you are so lucky to be with me, kind of an attitude.
This leads right into another question I have, because and this is maybe a little assumption I'm making. Maybe you'll clarify this. Women, or anyone, maybe abuse in any ways. Maybe it's hard to even say I'm in an abused relationship, right? But in these subtle abuse relationships, I would imagine it's even harder to admit that, right? So can you talk a little bit more about that? So how can a woman, acknowledge what's happening without blaming herself or feeling ashamed? And maybe this even because it's more subtle, is it harder than to acknowledge?
Absolutely. So, most of us sort of have the belief system that, okay, if my partner hits me or if there's physical violence, that's where the line is drawn and that's not okay. And so that's sort of the context from which all of our ideas and thoughts around abuse sort of stem from when we're talking about romantic relationships. The problem is that that is just one aspect or one method of abuse, and so it does not account for all the other ways that we can truly be damaged and harmed by someone else. And these subtle methods of control and subtle tactics are actually so damaging, because it keeps the person questioning and second guessing themselves, like you were just talking about, just wondering, well, it can't be that bad, or this, he apologized, or she didn't really mean it that way, or whatever. But what happens is, over time, this harmful behavior escalates and gets worse. And so, a lot of times people struggle with the word abuse. And so, it's a big word. There are a lot of, associations with it. So one thing that you can kind of replace it with, that I often will tell people, is, replace it with the word bullying, or think of it as sort of a bullying relationship if you can't swallow the word abuse, because it's the same type of dynamic that's created. What we're talking about, this isn't just people not seeing eye to eye, or disagreements that happen in a couple's relationship, which, that happens for everyone. What we're talking about is really a power differentiation in the relationship. And one person is seeking to dominate and control the other person. And so this person becomes more powerless over time and experiences all of the negative, consequences of feeling out of control in their own lives, while the other person gains more of that power and dominance over that person. So, that is a bullying dynamic, and so if that's an easier way to look at it, then whatever way it helps to sort of absorb the information. The label is less important. It's more understanding the power differentiation and the dynamic within the relationship.
I do think, though, that giving that analogy, or that, the similarness of bullying does help, because I think that might be, like you said, an easier way to swallow that or accept that, like, oh yeah, these are bullying aspects, and that's not okay in a relationship. And I think that's a great way to get somebody to move closer to what this is. So thank you for that explanation. Um, you also describe in this first chapter about abuse is a game constructed so that the abuser always wins. So once a woman recognizes that she's dealing with a larger pattern rather than isolated disagreements, what should she do next, right? So if you could help us kind of talk through that, what are those next steps of protecting herself, rebuilding her own trust and judgment, and of course, regaining her strength.
When we're talking about abuse as a game for the abuser, what I'm trying to describe in that is that, in a normal, healthy relationship, when there are areas of conflict or disagreement, or you can't get on the same page, there is still equality in the relationship. Both people have equal say, and there's an attempt toward figuring out solutions to the problem and sort of reconciling so that closeness is restored. So that's a normal, healthy relationship. Yes, people can get defensive at first. Yes, people can, disagree and need a little bit of time to cool off or whatever. That is all normal, healthy conflict. And you don't doubt that the person loves you or respects you, even in times of conflict. You feel safe still. And so, what we're talking about is that in an unhealthy relationship, in a controlling relationship, because the abusive person is their goal is the power and control in the relationship. You're coming at it like, let's figure out the solution to the problem so that we can become close again, and so things can be happy and peaceful. That's your motivation. That's your goal. So you work really hard to try to communicate that, maybe understand where your partner's coming from, come up with solutions to issues. Meanwhile, your partner isn't receptive, or that goalpost just keeps moving. So maybe you address one thing, and then all of a sudden the issue is taken a totally different direction, and you're getting blamed for this other thing way over here that wasn't at all what you were talking about. And so it keeps going to where you're the one that's to blame, and you often find yourself in the position of apologizing in order to restore the peace and just keep things as harmonious as possible, but your partner keeps finding fault with you, or changing what the issue is to where you can't ever get to that closeness. You know, unless it's sort of after one of these overtly abusive episodes, and then there's sort of this honeymoon phase, and that's when we can get more into traumatic bonding later. But that's kind of when we're talking about a game. You have to be able to sort of take a step back and look at the bigger picture, which is you can't really ever seem to get to the desired result, which is closeness and harmony in your relationship. So I think the second part to that question was what can you start to do? So if any of this is resonating, I think one of the most important and empowering first steps is to take a step back from your relationship as much as possible and try to observe it objectively. Learn about these patterns of behavior so that you're informed. And it will help you to see the whole dynamic much more clearly if you are, in fact, in one of these types of relationships. And so once we see the whole thing more objectively and we have more clarity about what is actually occurring, that's when we start to gain our strength back. We start realizing, okay, maybe this isn't all my fault. Maybe this isn't just me. Maybe I'm not losing my memory. Maybe I'm not as horrible and terrible as this person is making me out to be. And there's a lot of awareness that comes with that when we can sort of separate ourselves from the problem and kind of gain our strength and our confidence and sense of self back. And so, you know, that objectivity is really, really critical as one of the first steps. And so then you don't sort of keep getting sucked into whatever your partner is blaming you for, and getting really caught up in the nitty gritty of that, which just keeps you in this constant loop and constant chaos. You can actually pull yourself back and see the bigger picture of what's actually occurring. It's not about this little thing, it's about the overall pattern of control.
I love what you talked about earlier, that you have to be safe in conflict. I think that's really powerful. So I just wanted to circle back, because I think that's really, that resonated. For me, and you said so many great things, and that just the moments of reflecting and stepping back is so important. So I appreciate the answer. So thorough. Um, so finally, for a woman listening today who senses that something is wrong, but's maybe not ready to call it abuse, as we talked about earlier, what is that one thing you'd want her to know, or what to do, or what's that first step she can take right now as she's listening?
Absolutely. So, one of the first things that I think is really important to just acknowledge is that your feelings are valid. They are there for a reason, and they are there to give you more information. So, even when we can't necessarily identify exactly why we're feeling the way that we are, we maybe can't back it up with facts, or when we try to, we just get sort of lost in this confusion. I think it's really important to kind of bring yourself back to center and check in with your body. Check in with what your body is telling you, with what your feelings are telling you, because that is information. We often override our intuition. We often, especially as women, we are conditioned to be nice and to sort of keep the peace and make everything work, even at great cost. And so what's really important here is to tune into how you're actually feeling, and instead of just glossing over it and making rationalizations and excuses, give yourself some time and space to just acknowledge what's going on and how you're feeling, because then you can start to sort of sort through it and kind of look at, okay, what is causing me to feel this way, if I'm going to look at the bigger picture here.
Right. That's great. Avery, this has been a really great six questions that discussion that we've had. And there's a lot more to even this chapter. Of course, the whole book, right? The whole book is, if he's so great, why do I feel so bad? But I would like to let everyone know that there's ways to continue learning more and finding out more about your work at averyneal.com. And you have courses and training at, or to be able to help someone through this. Maybe you might want to share a little bit of that, but it's at psychologicalabuse.com, and you do have some courses there, Avery, that people can take and go to.
Absolutely. So I designed a 3-course series to almost be like you're, in therapy with me. So, the first, it's designed to be sort of start to finish, sort of the first things around, pattern recognition and understanding what's going on. And then all through sort of, finding yourself again and reclaiming your confidence and identity. And then, of course, healing the nervous system after this type of sort of chronic trauma. When you're living in one of these relationships, it is incredibly stressful. And so, learning to calm the body and the nervous system down is a really essential part of healing and recovery. So, the course series is designed to kind of walk you through each step of the process.
Great. So again, that's averyneal.com and psychologicalabuse.com. And Avery will continue this on a next video for chapter 2. So this is a great time and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.